In this episode, geography professor Dr. Maura Hanrahan explores creating heroes and claiming the North, Captain Robert Abram Bartlett in the Arctic. Captain Bartlett attempted the pole with Admiral Peary, worked to advance Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, and in 1914 was responsible for one of the most remarkable Arctic rescues of all time. Dr. Hanrahan will provide important insights on the role the Arctic exploration continues to play in Canada for the Inuit and for all Canadians.
As the crow flies, it's about 150 miles from Wrangel Island in the western Arctic Ocean to landfall in Siberia. In 1914, two men made this walk, but they didn't go as the crow flies. They wove their way across ice fields and around frigid open water. One of the men was Bob Bartlett, at 39, a famous explorer who had attempted the North Pole with Admiral Robert Peary 5 years before. The other man was an Inupiat teenager called Claude Kataktovik. The journey was arduous, requiring unfailing physical strength and alertness. Most days the light was bad. Neither Bartlett nor Kataktovik knew the way, and they did not know when they would come across open water, which posed a challenge for travel but also gave them opportunities to hunt seal and bear. As they struggled along, the ice moved incessantly, and there were blinding snowdrifts. A week into the journey, Bartlett noted, "A good deal of crisscross traveling was done today." The next day, they managed to cover only 4 miles. No one knew where they were. Their purpose in traveling was to effect a rescue of 15 people left behind on Wrangel Island, which you can see there, after their ship, the Karlik, had sunk. To do this, they had to reach the coast and then walk a further 500 miles to the East Cape of Russia. Much of the snow was deep and soft, making it difficult for the dogs and sledges as well as the men on their snowshoes. Sledges broke down often due to the rough ice and the pinnacles that dotted the white landscape. Repairs ate up precious time. The dogs kept chewing the harnesses and running away, and Bartlett and Kataktovik lost more time and energy trying to catch them. The men had no time to cook, so they ate raw bear and raw seal meat, caught by Kataktovik. The dangers of the trip necessitated constant decision-making. They were required to make hourly judgments about ice and about water. They had to carefully monitor the dogs' diets so they didn't become lethargic. At times, the dogs were frightened of the open water, especially after the sledge broke through the ice one time, saturating everything, including the animals. Bartlett and Kataktovik built igloos almost every night. One night, the wind tore the canvas top off their igloo, exposing them to the frigid air for the rest of the night. On March 26th, the weather was beastly. Bartlett had a nagging pain in his left eye, which sometimes became acute. It was a slow job, he later wrote laconically, as he often did when recalling times of stress. Kataktovik got depressed, telling Bartlett, "We see no land, we no get to land." Kataktovik struggled with pain in his hands and in his feet. Besides eye pain, Bartlett suffered snow blindness, as he frequently did in the Arctic, necessitating the almost constant use of snow goggles. He described the affliction as like having sand thrown in your eyeballs. So now that I've taken you into the Arctic, I want to welcome you here, Epshilazi, and thank you for coming, Welalin. I won't translate the whole talk into Mi'kmaq, so don't worry. I want to thank the University of Lethbridge, especially the Dean's Office and Catherine Reeder, and I also for this opportunity, and I also want to thank the people who work for us behind the scenes, notably in my case, Deb Bullock and Jessica Goodrider-Lowen. The journey to Siberia recalled Bartlett's 1909 trek with Admiral Robert Peary, who claimed to be the first person to reach the North Pole. On that trip, the explorers were similarly fatigued. As one of them wrote, "We staggered into camp like drunken men and built our igloos by force of habit rather than with the intelligence of human beings. When a rapidly shifting ice floe nearly caused their deaths, They were too full of the realization of their escape to have much to say. Peary called Bartlett the most valuable of all his expedition members. Bartlett was an established and experienced northern mariner before he ventured into actual polar exploration with Peary. In 1909, when the so-called heroic age of exploration was nearing its end, there was little crossover between the occupations of explorer and captain. In combining his duties and skills as a mariner with those of an explorer, Bartlett was both an innovator and a throwback to Captain James Cook. Cook was the 18th century Briton who mapped Newfoundland, circumvented New Zealand, and was the first European to reach Australia and Hawaii, driving what has been called the invasion of the South Pacific. Cook was a major contributor to ethnographic collections in the West, to Western science, to navigation, and in this way to the advance of empire. Bartlett would follow his footsteps. So tonight, I'll use a gender lens and a post-colonial framework to place Bartlett in the history of Arctic exploration, empire, and the popular culture of his day. In this, I'm responding to anthropologist Laura Nader's call to study the colonizer. To some degree, this necessitates a backgrounding of the Inuit, but I'll address that. I'll show how Bartlett worked and strove to create and maintain his image as a heroic Arctic explorer, an image that endures. Then I want to strip away the theory and look at the person, revealing, I hope, a little of his story and his essence as a human being. Throughout, I'll bring the historic Arctic into this room and emphasize some of the remarkable drama that marked Bartlett's life, because nothing beats a good story. So how many people have heard of Bartlett prior to now? That's not bad, that's good. So Bartlett was showered with awards during his life and afterwards. He won the prestigious Hubbard Medal, already given to Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian who would be the first to reach the South Pole. Later, the Hubbard Medal would be awarded to such luminaries as Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, aviator Charles Lindbergh, and the scientist Jane Goodall. Bartlett's home in Brigus, Newfoundland, was declared a National Historic Site in the late 1970s, and he featured on a postage stamp in 2009, which was the centenary of the attempt on the pole. Bartlett's career lasted from the early 1890s to almost to his death in 1946. His was a career of discovery with over 50 voyages to Meta Incognita, the unknown shore, as early explorers called the Arctic. And it's to the concept of discovery that we now turn. The Canadian Arctic expedition of 1913-1918 aimed to extend British and Canadian sovereignty into the unknown Western Arctic. Like most of these forays, it was a scientific project, the largest of its kind. Divided into southern and northern parties, the scientists collected thousands and thousands of animal, plant, fossil, and geological specimens. They took just as many photos. They shot more than 50 minutes of film, which was an amazing feat in the weather conditions they encountered and for that day and age. The northern party was navigated by Bartlett in the ship the Karlak and led by the controversial Icelandic Canadian explorer and anthropologist Vilhjálmur Stephensen. The parties identified several new Arctic islands. Expedition alumni published 14 reports on topics from Inuit folklore to botany. The expedition was also successful in its political mission, but there were mistakes and hangovers. One of them was the failed search for Crockerland. Stephensen believed there was such a place in the Western Arctic. He thought there might even be a race of blonde Eskimo living there. Fixated on the notion of race, which is not a physical reality, a lot of his supporters shared this belief. Through the expedition and dozens of Arctic trips that followed, Bartlett collected many plant and animal specimens. Some were live, including muskox and polar bears that he brought back to the United States. He handed these to universities and museums like the New York Botanical Garden, the American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian Institutes, and many others. Bartlett and others did so that did this so that these specimens could truly be discovered, named, dissected, classified, and ultimately owned. Here I speak of discovery as understood by the late Palestinian scholar Edward Said and by Maori scholar Linda Tuhahi Smith. The Inuit of the Western and Eastern Arctic, Greenland, and Labrador knew the islands that Bartlett et al. Discovered. They knew the plant and animal specimens, but these things could not be truly discovered until they were named, dissected, classified, and ultimately owned by non-Indigenous people. Classifying by species is deconstructing Indigenous worldviews, which see everything as part of the whole in ways too complex to describe here. Naming is taking possession of. This is how colonization works. Inuit understand this. When they renamed Frobisher Bay Hallowit, Place of the Fish, after the establishment of Nunavut in 2000, they were decolonizing. European philosophy and law facilitate and justify the process of colonization. And this is done most notably through ideas, specifically terra nullius, which means empty land, and the doctrine of discovery. If land is empty, meaning, in European thought, not used for sedentary agricultural purposes, it can be discovered. If it can be discovered, it can be possessed by those who discovered it. Thus, the absence of agriculture made the Arctic and subarctic vulnerable to discovery and all that followed discovery. Despite their long-standing presence in the Arctic and subarctic, Inuit were rendered invisible. The European tradition privileges and honors the individual, and this enabled the creation and recognition of Arctic heroes, which happened in small steps. For instance, a mollusk found in Labrador and Greenland was named after Bartlett. This is one tiny thread in the story of Bartlett's elevation, and of the story of the suppressing of Inuit knowledge and ideas and the assumption of ownership of Inuit lands. Bartlett is seen as a wildly successful Arctic explorer. In my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, he seems to be universally admired. The island is vast. It's the 9th largest in the world. And with Labrador, the province is 3.5 times the size of the 3 maritime provinces combined. We have an 11,000-kilometer coastline. We had few road connections until the late 1960s, with travel being mainly by boat. So most of the province's cultural groups are seagoing and really value marine skills and prowess. This is true of the Mi'kmaq, whose ships sailed to what is now New England. It's true of the Inuit, whose umiaks, larger vessels, took them hunting in the pretty wild Labrador Sea. And it's true of the settlers who came from the British Isles and from France to fish on the Grand Banks some 200 miles offshore. In my home province and in the United States, where he's better known than he is in Canada, Bartlett's remarkable adventures at sea and in a northern environment are very respected. I want us to see Bartlett through other lenses as well. In writing Unchained Man, my new biography of Bartlett, I wanted to dissect how he became the person he was and how he sustained his public image. I wanted to understand some of the contexts in which he operated. Bartlett was desperate to go north every year. It was where he felt at ease. He once said, "It's all right when you're exploring. You get used to rotten meat, frozen fingers, lice, dirt. The hard times come when you get back." But he needed money to have all this fun. And that meant being a celebrity, because collecting artifacts from museums and universities didn't pay the bills. Bartlett's long career in Arctic exploration was made possible by a marriage of his polar skills with the deliberate and sustained white heroic masculine image making. The word masculine is important here. In addition to its role in empire building, polar exploration aimed to shore up and bolster rigid ideas of masculinity. The Anglo-Irish explorer, Ernest Shackleton, once refused 3 female applicants to a polar expedition by bluntly stating, "There are no vacancies for the opposite sex on the expedition." The women had described themselves as strong, healthy girls, and also gay and bright and willing to undergo any hardships. Yet Shackleton dismissed them without hesitation. These women were going off script and attempting to shatter gender boundaries erected by male explorers and their many supporters, including governments. This matters today because Shackleton and other polar heroes, but Shackleton in particular, they're used as models of leadership in business schools throughout the Western world. Yet 100 years ago, the young women who wrote to Shackleton had identified the elements of heroic masculinity in their letter. Bravery while making hard decisions, carefully measured risk-taking, physical strength and courage, the ability to endure, stoicism. Victorian and Edwardian femininity was the opposite of these things. It was fragile, delicate, contained, predictable, small. Margaret Atwood understood this when she wrote, "Even though the North itself, or herself, is a cold and savage female, the drama enacted in it is a man's drama, and those who play it out are men." A noteworthy and colorful example of Bartlett's image making is his participation in a publication called The Stag Cookbook, A Man's Cookbook for Men. I didn't make this up. With over 100 other well-known men, Bartlett lent his name to this project. The book featured his fresh Labrador codfish recipe, even though he lived in New York's Murray's Hotel and had no access to kitchen facilities. Other contributors included Warren Harding, the 29th President of the United States, who would serve one more year in office after the book was published. Harry Houdini, who favored scalloped mushrooms and deviled eggs. Daniel Carter Beard, the founder of the Sons of Daniel Boone, later to become the Boy Scouts of America. Charlie Chaplin with steak and kidney pie, his predictable East End of London dish. And actor Douglas Fairbanks and many other people. Men, I should say, many other men. Bartlett's manly image appeared on boxes of Wheaties breakfast cereal in the 1930s and 40s, which was the cereal's heyday. His Wheaties endorsement described the unpredictable Arctic weather, with temperatures often dropping to -40 Fahrenheit or even lower. Colder than Lethbridge last winter, even. Wheaties, he proclaimed, provided the kind of breakfast a fellow appreciates when he finds himself surrounded by mile after mile of ice and snow. The truth is that whether I'm exploring the Arctic or resting up at home after a long trip up there, I prefer Wheaties, breakfast of champions. In 1935, the cereal company sponsored a Captain Bob Bartlett pirate contest with a Mickey Mouse watch as the grand prize. So amusing. Bartlett also endorsed Remington guns. "My Remington guns get a lot of use, hard use. Only a gun that measures up to the highest standards in materials and workmanship will stand up to the kind of pressure it's bound to get in the far north." This statement was printed on a tag attached to every Remington gun sold in the United States and was part of a large-scale campaign that included print ads in popular magazines. By the time the Remington and Wheaties ads appeared, masculinity had taken quite a knocking, with the decimation of a generation of men in World War I. Bartlett's heroics were part of a wider response to this, reasserting the rightful place of men. Now, to finance his Arctic voyages, Bartlett got himself a paying crew. Through the 1920s and 30s, he charged students from prep schools in New England $1,000 each to sail with him to Greenland. The young men were promised and got an adventure. They spent their summers scrubbing decks, learning to hunt seals and polar bears, sleeping on thin mattresses on the ship's saloon decks. Bartlett offered a fine training in teamwork, fair play and thoroughness, which was of the highest value in building sturdy American characters. The museum commissions and the recruitment of paying sailors depended on Bartlett's finely tuned public image. So he had to be heroic and adventurous, yet highly skilled and not foolhardy. He had to be macho, but also approachable. He had to inspire confidence as well as awe. This was a bit of a balancing act, but Bartlett managed it well. He did this in spite of himself, which I'll come back to. Most explorers gave lectures, and Bartlett was no exception. Dale Carnegie recommended lecture agent Bryant Santo to Bartlett, who gave hundreds of lectures through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, traveling extensively throughout the United States. According to one ad, Bartlett was a stirring speaker, combining adventure, pathos, and humor in an inimical manner, which is a gift of his Newfoundland ancestry and boyhood. Lecture invitations came from diverse organizations: the North Orange Baptist Church in Orange, New Jersey, the Dickens Irving Fellowship Centenary Committee in New York, whose program featured sea music and an appearance by Charles Dickens' granddaughter, Enid, the Philadelphia Club of Advertising Women, and the Norfolk Hunt Club. Bartlett also entertained the New York Tri-Ship Boys Club, which had enjoyed lectures by Will Rogers, fellow explorer Richard Byrd, and Count von Luckner, the German sailor known as the Sea Devil. Bartlett presented to the Cornell United Religious Work of Ithaca, the New England Museum of Natural History in Boston, and Johns Hopkins University, where he presented to the entire undergraduate body. There were other lecture recipients, including the Hebrew Orphan Home, the St. George's Men's Church Club, the Canadian Campfire Club in Cleveland, who knew, and the Graduates Club in New Haven. Howard Denbo of South Bend, Indiana, wrote encouragingly on behalf of his organization. "We just closed our season, had some fine programs, including 1 or 2 sea films, but the kids want Captain Bob Bartlett again. You certainly made a big hit with the youngsters, and the adults too." One of Bartlett's most popular lectures was called The Land of Lost Eskimos, in which he emphasized the harsh Arctic environment and the dangers it posed. Although the emphasis on danger and heroics was heightened, Bartlett's survival and presence provided reassurance to his audience. By exoticizing the Inuit, he portrayed himself as civilized and one of us. Yet he presented as a singular individual who could thrive in 2 contrasting worlds. On most occasions, he backgrounded the Inuit, although they were crucial to all his Arctic successes, as I explore in the book. So here's Kurlik. He's described as an indefatigable hunter, and Kirik, his wife, an excellent seamstress and fisher. These 2 people were central to the survival of the Canadian Arctic Expedition Northern Party, who were stranded on Wrangel Island in 1914, and for whom Bartlett and Kataktovik made their long walk to try and get a rescue. Bartlett was a product of his environment. Captain William, who's in that corner there, his father, was in Newfoundland parlance a Highliner, earning this title by bringing home the most skins from the spring seal hunt. Bartlett's great-great-grandfather was the legendary Captain Billy or Follow-On, mythologized in Newfoundland because of a trip he made in an open boat from Conception Bay, where you see Brigus there on the bottom, on the island all the way up to around Island of Ponds in Labrador. This was a hazardous journey of hundreds of miles. Plus, Follow-On had only one arm, a disability that he ignored. Bob's great-uncle, Captain Isaac, rescued the Tyson Party in 1873. They were the survivors of the Polaris expedition who'd been stranded so long on an ice floe they were about to resort to cannibalism. His uncle, Captain John, on whom he particularly modeled himself, became in 1866 the first Newfoundlander to earn his Master Mariner certificate. Captain John took American explorer Isaac Israel Hayes to the Arctic in 1853, and John also sailed with Peary of the 1909 North Pole adventure. Another of Bob's uncles, Captain Sam, navigated the ship, the Neptune, that claimed the Eastern Arctic for Britain in 1905, with ongoing repercussions for the Inuit. And Captain Moses, who's standing in the middle there, was another famed uncle. The fame and glory extended to Bartlett's mother's side of the family. Captain William Norman, a maternal great-uncle, had rescued the Greeley party in 1884. If you're going to get stranded on an ice floe, you want the Bartletts around. These were the 7 survivors who had been shipwrecked, stranded, and starving on Ellesmere Island, way up north. Thus, Bartlett grew up among the seafaring aristocrats of Newfoundland in Brigus, one of the island's most prosperous towns. Of Newfoundland, during Bob's childhood, parliamentarian Robert Parsons once roared, "Her argosies whiten every sea," without a great deal of exaggeration. From a well-educated class, his mother had been to boarding school in England. Bartlett was raised on the fireside stories of his accomplished forebears. A solitary and introverted figure, Bartlett moved to New York after the 1909 attempt on the North Pole. He had no apparent romantic relationships and few friends, although he was intensely loyal to those he did have. I discuss his sexuality at length in the book, but we don't have time for such intriguing matters here. Although his career entailed hobnobbing with the wealthy of the United States, he eschewed society. He had to beg to respond to dinner invitations, even dinners given in his honor. And this included dinners at the prestigious Explorers Club in New York. His papers are filled with letters that demonstrate his tendency to disappear from society for weeks on end. In constructing his public image, Bartlett ensured career success, but it came at some cost to him. It forced him to play a part. He papered over his mistakes at sea. The most memorable of these was the loss of the Carlac, the flagship of the Northern Party of the Canadian Arctic Expedition in 1914, and the deaths of no less than 11 of its members. Bartlett and Kataktovik raced to Siberia to effect a rescue of the remaining 15 Inuit scientists and crew members left behind on Wrangel Island. To maintain his public persona, Bartlett also suppressed his personal struggles, one of which was financial. Most of all, he masked his true personality and inclinations. Bartlett was, in fact, extremely cultured. He understood and appreciated classical music, having learned it from his elegant grandmother, Mary Lehman. He was an introvert who much preferred his own company and the books that literally covered his bed at the Murray Hotel, where he slept on the floor. He read vociferously, enjoying the classics as well as theology and poetry. He always carried a copy of the English translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Khayyam was a Persian poet and astronomer born 1,000 years ago. Bartlett studied botanical books and art. All this remained invisible to his legions of fans who wanted a tough, macho, salty dog kind of guy. We catch a glimpse of the real Bartlett through an article he wrote in the New York Times. About Greenland, the piece was lyrical, perhaps even purple and a bit fanciful, but it was the writing of a lover of words. Early in the morning, we saw a beautiful rainbow extending from the eastern to the western horizon, and the previous day, a marvelous display of northern lights, unusual for this time of year. It was weather that would make a West Indies cruise agent turn green with envy, as under tropic-appearing skies, with a smooth sea, we footed our way north, while a glorious Apollo cavorted through a sky of cerulean blue. On the deck of the Morrissey, we felt like Cortez when he stared at the Pacific, and all his men stared at each other in wild surmise. Only we, not silent as he and his men on a peak in Darien, but on the deck of the Morrissey, were joyful. Here, Bartlett did not write about drama and adventures. He was content to sink into the spirituality of the Arctic, capturing the yearning and quoting the tragic English poet John Keats. This passage shows clearly that Bartlett should have been left to write his memoirs himself, but they were ghost-written. His sense of connection with the Arctic recalls the philosophers of nature, Barry Lopez and Annie Dillard, perhaps even Thoreau at times. But his books were ghost-written, as I said. If he had written his own books, they would have contained another layer of Arctic life. This is sadly missing from his chatty, folksy, and shallow, if entertaining, tomes and lectures. But perhaps sophistication would not sell. And Bartlett was pragmatic enough to do what had to be done so he could make his trips to the Arctic. Meanwhile, the texts he left behind reveal a great deal about how and why the Arctic was imagined as it was, as a dangerous and lonely place in the service of white male heroes like Bartlett. Most crucially, as a place that could and should be conquered. We live with this legacy today. In particular, the Inuit live with this legacy. Bartlett kept a diary as he and Kataktovik scrambled to Siberia from Wrangel Island. He wrote, "Kataktovik was with me and built our igloos and killed seal and bear. An Eskimo and a white man could live indefinitely on the ice." He described his relief when Kataktovik suddenly called, me see him, Nuna, land." The following day, they could see the land more clearly in spite of their persistent eye trouble. But for the better part of a week, they had to deal with moving ice, very bad light, and dogs that were feeling poorly. Finally, after 3 weeks doing battle with the Arctic Ocean, they reached land on April 5th. Thick snow limited their visibility, but they found the dwellings of the indigenous Chukchi and at long last spent a comfortable night. Some 2 weeks later, they reached Siberia's East Cape. They had traveled 700 miles, most of it on foot. Now I want to pay attention to Claude Kataktovik. Kataktovik was a 19-year-old Inupiaq man from Port Hope, Alaska. The Inupiat, part of the circumpolar Inuit group, constructed driftwood and sod houses which were partly subterranean. Kataktovik would have spent much of his life in such structures. These houses were home to 1 or 2 families totaling 8 to 12 people, and they were built around another large building which served as a council house and was known as a karki. The Inupiat built their economy and society around the bowhead whale. The yearlings they hunted often weighed about 10,000 kilograms. Whalers were organized into crews that hunted from umiaks. The umiak teams were led by umieliks, who owned the boats, directed hunting rituals, and wielded substantial power. Women married to umieliks were responsible for creating the right conditions for whaling, and this happened on spiritual and social levels. There was then a very well-developed social hierarchy in Inupiat society, which had been relatively stable for almost a millennium. This rigid structure and the knowledge of one's place in it would serve Kataktovik well during the Karluk crisis when heeding Bartlett's orders was vital. The racialized power imbalance inherent in polar exploration added another dimension to Kataktovik's experience with inflexible social structures. It wouldn't have shocked him, though. Kataktovik was born about 1895 in a time of great transition for the Inupiat. The mainstay bowhead whale economy was in precipitous decline because of rapacious American whaling. Because the whales were disappearing, the caribou population was all but exterminated by the Inupiat themselves. Thus, the Canadian Arctic Expedition's so-called local assistance, including Kataktovik, would have needed the work the expedition offered. From the early 19th century, European diseases arrived to the Inupiat, soaring to epidemic proportions. So along with the whale and the caribou, the people were in decline. By the 1880s, the writing was on the wall for the cultural continuity and stability the Inupiat had long enjoyed. Because of the Swedish Lutheran mission activity in the region, Christianity was on the rise. This resulted in the conversion of most Inupiat, although, like indigenous people everywhere, they were able to adapt their new belief system to their own ideas. Given the emergencies facing the Inupiat, Christianity, with its ideas of heaven and salvation, had great appeal. And throughout the Arctic, Inuit conversions were responses to crises of an unfamiliar nature. This was the case with the Northern Labrador Inuit, who were known to Bartlett from his youth. These Inuit converted to Moravianism in the late 1700s, following devastating epidemics. Kataktovik would have been raised with Inupiat values and stories, as well as those related to what has been called Eskimoized Christianity. Kataktovik's childhood would have been stressful, unlike Bartlett's, which featured leisurely Sunday afternoons with the cultured grandmother Lehman, as well as the unthreatened affluence of his Highliner father, Captain William. Kataktovik was a widower at only 19. He had left his daughter in the care of his mother so he could work for the expedition. Kataktovik could read and write. Bartlett often loaned him books and magazines and taught him to decipher nautical charts. Bartlett gave him blank books to write in and mused, "What would Peary say?" in reference to Admiral Peary's belief that the Inuit should not become dependent on the white man's methods of life. Bartlett did not hold to Peary's way of thinking and realized that social change was inevitable for the Inuit. As well he might, given his role and that of his uncles, not to mention Peary's in bringing it about. He did not view such changes as necessarily negative, although perhaps he could have. Bartlett's Inupiaq language skills were as rudimentary as Kataktovik's English. It seems they spoke a basic mixture of both tongues to each other. Many instances demonstrate Kataktovik's resourcefulness and budding leadership skills. It's unfortunate that we have his voice only in his second language, which tends to mask a speaker's intelligence and obscure their personality. After the Karluk first foundered, Bartlett began executing rescue plans. He and Kataktovik spent weeks laying trails and making roads. These experiences fed the captain's confidence in the younger man. After this work, Bartlett decided how rescue would be achieved. "I would take Kataktovik with me. He was sufficiently experienced in ice travel and inured to the hardships of life in the Arctic to know how to take care of himself in the constantly recurring emergencies that menace the traveler on the ever-shifting surface of sea ice." In the short and sometimes terse entries in his Karluk journal, Bartlett often referred to Kataktovik as the Eskimo. His tone changed as he digested his experience. In the ghost-written The Last Voyage of the Karluk, chapter 19 is titled "Kataktovik and I Start for Siberia." This is unusual in polar literature. It was an intimation of the respect Bartlett had for Kataktovik, and it was an indicator of the relationship between them. Their bonds showed hints of relative egalitarianism, at least for the time and place. This relationship could never be one of equals, though. Bartlett was a seasoned 39-year-old, twice Kataktovik's age, and old enough to be his father. He was the captain. He was a famous explorer who had navigated for Peary, and he was white. In Siberia, he reverted to the conventions of polar exploration on at least one occasion when he ordered Kataktovik to fetch his mug from the sledge to bring into a Chukchi dwelling. Now, Kataktovik feared the indigenous people of Siberia. As Bartlett recalled, he was sure they were going to kill him. This belief resulted in the history of warfare in the Bering Strait in the 18th and 19th centuries, motivated largely by economics. When they had first sighted land, Kataktovik was afraid to advance. Bartlett worked hard to persuade him to continue on. He knew he needed the young man's cooperation. Not lending Kataktovik's misgivings any credence, he tried to ignore them. He tried also to capitalize on Kataktovik's smoking habit, telling the young man he'd be able to secure tobacco from the natives in Siberia. Still, they stood on the Arctic ice, while Kataktovik worried and weighed his very limited options. He was oppressed by his thoughts, but he was also cold, hungry, and sore. In his mind were visions of the men, women, and children left behind on frosty Wrangel Island, as well as his own baby daughter at home. He bravely took a step forward and did not stop until they finally saw signs of human life. Thankfully, Kataktovik's fears were completely unfounded. The two visitors were received with kindness and remarkable generosity. As Bartlett described their initial meeting, I put out my hand and walked toward them, saying in English, "How do you do?" They immediately rushed toward us and grasped us each warmly by the hand, jabbering in great excitement. Deeper communication was difficult, though. As Bartlett put it, they were as ignorant of my language as I was of theirs. Bartlett was full of admiration for all the Chukchi he encountered. It went beyond the relief and appreciation that were inevitable after his dangerous journey. It was down to the people themselves. The Chukchi fed and sheltered Bartlett and Kataktovik, saving their lives. They traded in a just manner, offering the visitors a much-needed dog in exchange for a gun. One man went out of his way to return a dog he had traded with Bartlett, but that had run back home. Bartlett came to appreciate the complexities of Chukchi culture. He figured out that his behavior did not always meet their standards, such as when he used a less than gentle tone of voice. The Chukchi chose not to point out his transgressions. This was the first time Bartlett truly grasped the nuances of indigenous ways. In the main, he did so respectfully. But he could be patronizing, and like most explorers, he failed to use the names of the indigenous people he encountered. Of the Chukchi, he said effusively, "Never have I been entertained in a finer spirit of true hospitality, and never have I been more thankful for the cordiality of my welcome." It was, as I was afterwards to learn, merely typical of the true humanity of these simple, kindly people. Bartlett's time in Siberia was a balm after a great deal of trauma, and he realized that the Chukchi had made it so. Through the weeks in Siberia, Kataktovik matured and became relaxed around the Chukchi. He traded with them on his own, procuring flour and other goods. He spent time alone with them. He had come to recognize elements of Chukchi culture, and he'd become comfortable in an unfamiliar milieu. Kataktovik's wariness never quite disappeared, however, and at times he seemed to be on guard. He worried about the captain's excitement and enthusiasm in conversation, even before Bartlett recognized it was a bit of a problem. "You must not talk that way," he told Bartlett. In this, he was telling Bartlett what to do and not do. It appeared that the captain took Kataktovik's advice seriously. This is an unusual upturning of racialized polar exploration relationships. I like to think of Bartlett and Kataktovik during their time on the Arctic Ocean as stripped down to their essence. Two people reduced to the animals that we all are, trying to survive. I like to take away theoretical approaches, this lens and that lens, and focus on their humanity, which is usually buried beneath layers of identity and status and so on. What happens when nature takes all this away? What does it leave? As far as we can discern, what is the human story here? Bartlett expressed his appreciation for the skills and companionship offered by Kataktovik and sent the young man's pay to him as soon as was possible after it was all over. Of their leave-taking at Siberia's East Cape after 5 weeks together, Bartlett wrote, "We were parting here. I thanked him as I bade him goodbye for all that he had done, and told him how greatly I was indebted to him for his constant help and for his faith and trust in me." In an almost fatherly tone, Bartlett added, "I asked Mr. Carpendale, a trader, to tell the Chukchis what a good boy Kataktovik was. I gave him the rifle we had carried on our journey and some other things we had with us, and then we shook hands warmly and parted." Now, the symbolism of the rifle as a gift cannot be overstated. The two men would never see each other again. The 19th century explorer Charles Hall was one of the few to treat Inuit as full human beings. He afforded them the respect which was rightfully theirs. Other explorers, including Peary, recognized the value of Inuit technology and skills in advancing their own ends. In general, polar explorer-Inuit relationships were unequal and racist, sometimes profoundly so. They were also sexist, the sexism directed at Inuit seamstresses, whose generally unacknowledged work was so crucial to Arctic expeditions. For a brief moment on the ice, Bartlett and Kataktovik experienced an intimacy that transcended all the social constructions that imbued polar exploration. Our ascribed and our chosen identities and our cultural affinities are important to us, sometimes in a political sense. In the end, though, we all get hungry, we all get thirsty, and we all long for connection. We know this from Plato's Symposium, from Rumi's poems, from verses penned by Maya Angelou, from the words of Anishinaabe writer Winona LaDuke, Mark Rothko's paintings, and so on. Indefinitely on the ice, Bartlett and Kataktovik were like family in the best sense of the word. The Arctic, with all her cruelty, allowed this to happen and made it happen. In doing so, the Arctic offered us a valuable lesson in our common humanity, what we can be to each other, and even how we get there. In my recently published book, I unpack the Bartlett legend and offer a reshaping of Bartlett. He was a flawed and gifted human being, born into a particular time and place, buoyed by certain privileges, constrained by certain other factors, hampered by them. I titled the book Unchained Man in reference to British journalist Philip Gibbs' characterization of Bartlett in 1927. Gibbs wrote, "When I met Captain Bartlett, I thought of Chains," which is a poem by Byron. "For here was an unchained man, unfettered and unmanacled, he stood free, body and soul." Bartlett was not unchained, of course. No one is. Like Kataktovik, he was a real person. And I hope that in the book that I've been able to unchain him from the mythology that has hidden him and that has obscured the many meanings of Arctic exploration for so long. Thank you.